we've got another event for our series on MRV coming at you today. We're going to have more in the future on different methods of MRV. We wanted to unpack direct air capture into mineralization because there's been some extremely interesting developments in recent weeks, publishing methodologies for how to do so, knowing that direct air capture is a leading way of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, and mineralization is an excellent way of having the CO2 react and make it permanently, durably put into the ground once more. So how we monitor that, report it, and verify that it is doing what it is doing and that it is going to stay where it's supposed to stay, that's extremely important for us. Thank you all to those who've contributed to make today's event a carbon negative event. As we typically do, we're going to go through our panel discussion for about maybe 35, maybe 40 minutes, and then Q&A with all of you. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and if we have time, we can get to questions that you pose. We'll have our typical networking session at the top of the hour. That's when we'll stop the recording. And if you want to stay around, get to know other people, not just know of other people, if that makes sense. We'd love to have you stay then so that we can do a little bit of breakout networking. With that, I wanted to give the Zoom to our moderator for today, Dr. Claire Nelson of Columbia University and Carbon Direct. Claire, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you, Jason, as always, for organizing such fantastic events. I'm Claire Nelson. As Jason said, I'm a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University, among a couple other hats I wear in the CDR space. So really happy to be here today. And I don't think most of our panelists warrant a huge introduction. I'm sure you're all familiar with the companies that they work for because they're some of the most well-renowned companies in this space, in my slightly biased towards mineralization opinion. But I think we'll start out today, before we get into some questions, just going through and having each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll come back to each of them and learn more about what their company and their technology does. So first, just maybe starting with Friedel, like, how did you get into this? And just a quick introduction to you and what you do for Climeworks.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Friedel. I'm the carbon market verification specialist at Climeworks. I oversee the MRV and certification processes. And we just issued 2 methodologies along with CarbFix about how to measure CDR at Climeworks and for DAC and mineralization. I got into this as an engineer, so I was doing remediation projects and just thought, hey, we can eliminate a lot of these projects that are caused by climate change if we change our policy and get better solutions in place. So an engineering background, kind of shifting into policy, and yeah, just that's how I got here, I guess.
Thank you. Casey, you want to go next, and then Elham?
Happy to. Hi, Casey Leist. Great to be here with all of you today. I lead carbon finance at CarbonCure, and with that, oversee our MRV and certification program, as well as the sale of our carbon credits. And prior to CarbonCure, came from the soil carbon space and saw CarbonCure as an opportunity to continue to accelerate all the technologies and innovations associated with addressing climate change.
Thanks. And finally, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elham. I'm the reservoir manager with 4401, and I basically handle everything technical and engineering related to subsurface operations. And my background is also engineering, subsurface reservoir evaluation, and I come actually from the oil and gas center, and I'm lucky enough to enter the CDR and the climate tech. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's really interesting to hear all the different backgrounds that lead people into CDR. So thanks for that. So my first question is for each of the panelists, and maybe we'll go in that same order, is just a little bit tech focused. So a lot of the questions that were submitted as part of the registration were just people wanting to learn more about what DAC and mineralization is. So if each of you could just give a quick overview to your process, and then specifically, how do you verify that it's doing what it's meant to do? And I think that feel free to get into a little bit of technical detail, is like what actually are the technologies that verify that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So starting with Climeworks, the capture part.
Yeah, so the capture part, I think it's the easiest part to understand and the easiest part to measure as well. But basically, we have fancy filters that we're filtering out carbon dioxide from the air. So we have big fans that run atmospheric air across selective filters where the carbon dioxide bonds. Once the filters are full, the chamber seals up and we heat it to about 100 degrees. That releases the carbon dioxide, and it gets liquefied and compressed into a liquid carbon dioxide that we then can do whatever with. But currently our plant in Orca, we give it to our partners CarbFix to mineralize and store. So that's very simple what it does. How we measure it, it's also very simple because we liquefy the CO2 and we can measure with flow meters, you know, exactly what's happening, and we can see it just like you measure the pump of your gasoline. You can measure the CO2 that you've actually captured and measure that all along in the process. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, Casey.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just give a quick background on CarbonCure. So we are downstream. We are focused on the storage of that CO2. And CarbonCure develops carbon removal and reduction technologies for the concrete sector. Our mission is to save 500 million tons of CO2 annually. We develop retrofit technology that injects a precise dose of CO2 into concrete in a manner where it becomes chemically converted into a calcium carbonate mineral within concrete during the normal manufacturing process. This carbon mineralization offers permanent storage, just as if you had pumped it underground in geological storage. So even if the concrete is demolished, the CO2 will not be re-released back into the atmosphere. Additionally, when CO2 is mineralized into concrete, it actually increases its strength and performance by up to 10 to 20%. And what that allows us to do is then reduce the amount of cement that would otherwise be used in concrete manufacturing process, providing further carbon savings, as cement represents 90% of the GHG emissions from concrete. To date, our technology has saved more than 200,000 tons of CO2. And as it relates to our MRV solution, the great thing with mineralization is that it's very robust. There's a lot of scientific studies and a lot of verification and data that was already available. With ours, we were able to track everything from the CO2 capture down to the injection in real time with telemetry. So we have a system set up to take into account how many emissions and energy usage were associated with the capture of that CO2, how many miles was the CO2 transported from the CO2 capture standpoint to the concrete producer, where the CO2 is then injected into concrete. And most of the emissions at the concrete plant are associated with energy usage as well. So we have technology put in place. We get all of that in real time, and allows us to have a high MRV solution associated with it. And so effectively, with every single carbon credit that we generate, we're able to take into account what are the net emissions saved. So just the full life cycle for every single carbon credit generated associated with it. And we have the methodology that we developed with Vera, VM43, that walks through all of that in detail as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to asking about Vera and certification bodies like that. But next up, we'll learn about 4401.
Yeah, so I also give a little background about 4401. We do in situ CO2 mineralization in peridotite rock formations. We have completed our pilot injection with encouraging results and gearing up for the first phase of our commercial injections very soon. Since you said I can get into the technical part of the verification, and the measurements, I am going to get a little bit technical here. You can picture the boundaries of our storage sites with the reservoir, the rock formations, with an injection well on one side and a monitoring borehole or multiple monitoring boreholes within a certain distance of that. And basically, this is a closed system, assuming that there is no leakage. And then we have a flow meter at the entry of the boundary on the wellhead of the injection borehole. And this is where we can precisely measure the volume and the composition of the injection fluid. So we can see how much CO2 we're injecting downhole. And then we recover basically water. We take samples from the monitoring borehole, and then we do mass balance calculations to see how much of the CO2 was lost along the way. And we prove that that CO2 has been mineralized. If I can get a little bit more into the technical part. So, we use non-reactive geochemical tracers, and that's the main technique that it's been used in situ mineralization for, measurements for verification. You can picture the CO2, we dissolve it in the water and we inject it down the hole. As it starts migrating into the formation, it starts basically mixing with the water that is already existent in the formation. So by co-injecting these non-reactive tracers, we are able to correct for this dilution factor, basically, when we are measuring for how much carbon has been lost and mineralized. We also, when we sample the water, we also measure, cations like calcium, magnesium, iron, etc. That they show us that the actual chemical reactions are occurring in the formation. They're basically a proof of mineralization, and they show that because these are basically the precipitation of these minerals. It shows us that the highly acidic fluids that we're injecting, they're reacting with the highly reactive peridotite rocks, and it's all due to the mineralization happening and not degassing or escaping the formation or anything like that. And the geochemistry of the whole operation could get quite complex, but when it comes down to the actual mass balance calculations, it's pretty straightforward. We have an input, we have a measurement of at the monitoring boreholes, and we can correct it for dilution. And it's very reliable, basically, when it comes to measuring for verification purposes.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I do love the technical detail personally as a scientist studying this space as well. And I think that everyone probably really appreciated that from all of you. So thanks. Okay, so I'm sure there's a million questions about the actual tech and gadgets and whatnot that goes into the verifying, but maybe I'll leave room at the end for audience questions on that. But first, just kind of like zooming out to a bigger picture. So you all gave really good explanations about how you verify, specifically the drawdown or mineralization involved with your technique. But bigger picture speaking, a removal is drawdown minus the emissions and kind of the full picture of carbon accounting. So a lot of different verifying goes into that, verifying your baselines, your additionality, and these words that may not be so familiar with everyone in the audience here. But just basically, yeah, maybe I'll start by singling out Casey, since he did mention that there is saved tonnage associated with your process. So how do you verify the kind of other aspects of the full picture of the removal other than just the CO2 that you're taking out of the air or putting into a mineral, like the kind of emissions that might be associated with your process or the saved tonnage, and just verifying the different pieces of carbon accounting? So maybe I'll start by singling out Casey there.
Yeah, happy to. There are effectively three core stages in the LCA on our side. There's and it's mainly, will fall into two of the three, are mainly is energy usage, or how many kilowatts of electricity we're using, and then the number of miles that the CO2 has been transported, since pipelines don't really exist today. And then we just, most of those, we know how those trucks are powered, and then we can take into account the emissions associated with that fuel. So it first starts at the capture standpoint of the CO2. So it's mainly how much energy was associated with capturing, compressing, and liquefying that CO2. All the CO2 that is transported to concrete plants is liquefied in order to greater enable the trucking of that CO2. On the second component, as it relates to transportation, we know exactly where the CO2 capture plant is, where the concrete plants are that are utilizing our technology. And so we know how many miles the CO2 is transported to take into account the fuel emissions associated with that transportation. And then the third component is mainly the electrical or energy usage associated with the injection of that CO2 from our technology itself. And we get all of that in real time. We know exactly how many kilowatts have been used throughout each individual injection of that CO2 and the exact number of tons of CO2 that have been injected into that concrete as well. It's all part of our precise measurement and dosing process that we go through with concrete producers. So we get all of that sent to us, and we're able to take into account how many tons of CO2 were injected, how many tons were associated or emissions were associated with getting that CO2 injected and mineralized to be able to take into account the net benefit associated with it.
Great. That's really interesting. Thank you. And yeah, I figured that the CarbonCure process might be the best example to give our audience, since that is probably the more complicated of the accounting in terms of both save tonnage and transport and stuff. But if Elham or Friedel, you have anything to add, feel free. But if not, I'll move to the next question, but go ahead.
Yeah, just add quickly, in our methodology for Orca, what we've also included is the construction and dismantling costs. So we have a LCA of cradle to grave, and we feel it's really important to include all the emissions for the project, including those that you put in to build your plant and take it down. As we're solely in the business of removals, we think it should all be included. So we have third-party LCA that has identified what these emissions are based off of research emission factors and our cut list for construction. And then in addition to that, similar to Casey said, we have our operational emissions. And in addition to electricity, as Casey said, we also use water and we use sorbent. So as a DAC plant, the filtering material is sorbent. And we also think that that's a really important thing for other DAC companies in the industry to consider, is that depending on what sorbent you use, that can be really efficient or it can be really inefficient. So we're always a big proponent of include all the emissions and take a big picture stance at it.
Great, thanks.
I'll just also quickly add that, when we talk about emissions, we also consider any sort of unintentional release anywhere along the operation, especially, for us, anything subsurface related, obviously any potential pathway to leakage has to be identified, assessed, and then, basically in the MRV, we should have how do we prevent that, and then how do in the unlikely case that any leakage happens, how do we calculate that and involve that in, basically include that into our calculations.
Okay, thank you. So then this question's kind of tough, I guess, and vague, but you've all kind of touched on this a bit, but just bigger picture, how are we thinking about uncertainty related to verifying all the different aspects of the carbon accounting? But maybe, I know that's a big question, so maybe let's just focus on the actual removal or mineralization piece. And I think that it's probably much more straightforward for us on this panel than for some other types of CDR in terms of uncertainty. But yeah, I guess just wanted to know how you're thinking about that and how you're kind of navigating that in terms of verifying a removal, quantifying it.
Yeah, I think for us, we just recognize that you can't avoid uncertainty, right? Especially being new technologies and new approaches out there. There's not enough data to really rely on to say, oh, okay, this is the uncertainty, and this is, how we properly account for it. So I think our approach has just been to take a conservative approach, right? And to accept that this is going to be a learning process. We're doing the best we can with the information we have. And as more data comes out, then we can narrow in these uncertainties and, have more efficient removal process. But currently, wherever we're not sure, we just take the broad stroke and take a really conservative approach. And like Elham was saying, if you have emissions that are releasing back out from after injection, or sometimes you have to release emissions from just your process, then you just take the most conservative approach, right? As soon as you detect there was a leak, our protocol is, well, if you can identify exactly how much was leaked, then great, you know, your data supports that, your auditor will verify that. But if you can't, then the whole period that you had that leak, you just scrap it, because the last thing we want to do is create a bad reputation, right? And it's easier to come back and be more stringent and fight for more CDR, but it's harder if we set loose standards now that allow other players to come in with less integrity.
Great. That's
I'll jump in here, sorry, to add a little bit on what Casey mentioned at the beginning, that when it comes to mineralization, we are very much, developed when it comes to measuring the mineralization with the geochemical tracing. There is like a solid body of scientific research plus actual like field data to support that. The concept, we managed to prove that in our pilot injection, and then there is years of injection in basalt from Carbfix, that proves that mineralization is occurring. So when it comes to the analytical methods, I think it's well established. However, if when it comes to the uncertainty, I would say for us with the in situ mineralization, we are not 100% sure as where the mineralization is occurring. We know that it's happening. We know the rate of, how rapid it's happening and all, but we cannot tell exactly where in the formation it's happening. So we're spending actually a lot of time and energy to develop some, to come up basically with some technologies that we can test out in our next project, mostly like geophysical solutions maybe that we can use as a time-lapse, survey. That maybe can help us to be like as an extra layer of certainty to be able maybe even to do some modeling with it, to do some quantification as well, just to compare that with the geochemical tracing, just to add to the certainty of the calculations.
And I think it was well summarized. I would just say that for the type of CDR that the various panelists' technologies can enable here, it is just much easier and more robust verifiability. Relative to others, you don't really have to rely on model-based assumptions with this, just to the high verifiability. And then, as was mentioned, just the robust science backing up as far as the permanence of it. But just as it relates to any uncertainty, similar to Climeworks, we've worked with various third parties to build out what that MRV solution would look like. And it also takes into account if they see any areas for uncertainty, the discounts that they believe should be applied based on the data that had to be provided to them in order to enable that carbon credit to be generated. And then we're all continuing to work with various third parties to make everything even more robust associated with it as well. But these solutions are a little bit just much easier from a verifiability standpoint with it.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree. So I just sent in the chat one of the verification frameworks that's kind of used, I guess, in terms of DAC plus mineralization or DAC plus storage. And they pretty much define verification as a metered output from DAC and then proof that it was turned into a mineral. So that's essentially good enough, because for those of you who don't know, is once it's mineralized, it's going to stay there forever unless you heat it to like 900 degrees Celsius. So pretty much durable forever. So everything that our panelists are doing is pretty much above and beyond. But in that context, like, because you're putting a lot of effort and transparency into this high quality verification, that obviously not all verifications are created equal amongst CDR tech. So my next question is really like, who pays for this verification? Who pays for MRV? Is it the person buying the removal? And how does a relative quality factor into that price? And since you're all separately doing MRV, but the removal is technically DAC plus mineralization, how does the credit or the purchase of that removal get split amongst the capturer and the mineralizer, if that's a word? So yeah, maybe starting with Friedel.
Yeah, I'll start with the last question of how does it get split. For us, with our partners at Carbfix at Orca, it's pretty easy. They provide us a service and they do the storage component. We pay them for that, and then the credit part of it we take on ourselves as the entity owner of project orca, right? It's a little complicated, but in the end, yeah, we pay them for what they do, and then we sell the credits and deal with that messy part. And yeah, who pays for it? I think it's a complicated question, right? I think in the end, like any product, I think whoever buys it is paying for the MRV, because if we want to be a sustainable business, then those costs have to go into the product. Yeah, I think it's hard at this point to really identify who's paying for it.
Yeah, thanks. Casey or Elham?
Yeah, happy to add that. I agree with everything that was just said there. On who should pay for it, I think the market is doing some of that work now. There's a lot of conversations around having the government be more involved, or just almost a third party who is unassociated with the sale and purchase of that carbon credit. Today, the project developers are often paying third parties to verify it, such as what we're doing, and I believe what Climeworks does as well. Ultimately, we're selling those carbon credits, so you can, depends if you want to think about the buyers ultimately paying for that, because that's part of the cost of the carbon credit associated with it. But I guess the first out-of-pocket cost often comes to the project developers in order to generate that carbon credit and have to go through the verification, and then ultimately that is passed on to the buyers. As it relates to who should pay for that, again, I think market, there's a lot of thoughts in the market right now about how that should be done. But today it's normally falling on the project developers, and then that cost is often passed on upstream. And then obviously there's a lot of work, I think, and thoughts going on around, particularly on other CDR solutions, which are going to be necessary to get where we want to with the Paris climate goals, on, I think, level of confidence, just a high degree of confidence versus 100% degree of certainty, and where does that, the cost can be different there to be 100% certain versus 95% confidence interval and so forth, and exactly if those additional costs are worth it to be able to get there. And I think we'll be learning more over the coming years, but hopefully the government ends up getting more involved in this, at least for some of the CDR solutions that often have to rely on some model-based assumptions just in order to enable those to grow and to make some of those investments that are required, that are harder for individual project developers to take on themselves, particularly before they've sold the first carbon credit.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree with what Friedel and Casey said. So for us, it's basically what Friedel explained. We also offer basically mineralization services to DAC companies, point source capture, whoever that has the CO2. And at this point, we build in the MRV costs into our service fees, basically. So it will be interesting to see how things change in the coming years.
Yeah, I'm sure that we all hope that at least the voluntary market still kind of is willing to pay based on the quality of verification, because like I said, it's not created equal amongst all different types of removals. So I guess this kind of segues into my next question, which is I'm seeing a lot of kind of third-party MRV specific startups pop up, like companies that are starting just specifically with their tech for MRV. And I know you guys all put a lot of effort into MRV specifically, which is factored into the price. So how do you see these kind of third party, not necessarily like an LCA certification type company, but an actual like private for-profit MRV company, like fitting into your technology, if at all? And yeah, if there's any kind of like space for that company to be in this DAC to mineralization world.
I'm happy to go first. I would say on the in the existing VCM market, on the auditors kind of already exist through the registries, the VVBs and so forth with that. So that is who we've worked with in the past, and will continue to work with in the immediate future. So some of those entities who do just the auditing and verification of that data that we've measured and then reported. There's obviously a lot of innovation, I think, on the mineralization side, and then particularly on the DAC side, that the ability to get that data in a high fidelity manner, robustly, and generally pretty cost effectively is much easier than some of the other solutions. And I think all of us have had to build that into implicitly into our back-end systems just for the technology to work the way that we want. It's been kind of imperative in order just to be able to generate a carbon credit. So we've made those investments on our side with it, and it allows us to work with the concrete producers better as well. As just you need to have very precise injections of CO2 that goes into that concrete for them, and then ultimately for their end use. But I think there's a lot of room for MRV innovation and startups. Obviously, we've seen a lot of innovation there on the broader nature-based side, from forestry to soil carbon. And then I think there's a lot of interest in startups on the ocean-based side who are thinking about things in a different way too. So I think a lot of room for growth there, and I think it's going to be imperative for the carbon credit market to scale, and then obviously be able to do everything in a robust manner.
Great, thank you. And Elham and Friedel, are you guys thinking of using kind of third-party certification bodies? And if so, which ones and why? I guess a lot of people asked about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think our hope is like right now we're using DNV to audit against the methodology we created based on the ISO standard. But our hope is that we have bigger industry players like Gold Standard and Vera, issue high integrity methodologies for DAC and mineralization that we can fall into those industry leaders, right? I think it's important that the market has fewer certification bodies that are well regarded and really transparent. It's easy to identify the quality that comes behind them, rather than have 100 of them and just kind of overwhelm the market and make it confusing for consumers and dilute the quality behind each label, right? So I'm hoping that we see industry leaders that have been industry leaders in the past come forth with good high integrity standards. But as Casey was saying, there's lots of room for innovation, and there's lots of room for these conversations to be had on all fronts, right?
Yeah, so at 4401 at the moment, we are drafting our MRV plan in-house, mostly on the monitoring and the measurement part. We're doing, extensive technology assessments, but then when it comes to the point that we need to certify the methodology, yeah, we reach out to the third parties. We are part of the CCS Plus initiative, working to develop a methodology with Vera, alongside with many other companies. But I also think, to answer the first part of your question, when you mentioned not verification related, but maybe in the holistic level, at a project level, I think it's a lot of what goes into the MRV is that the first big M, when you have to monitor and measure, and at a project level, I think that's just like a really thorough risk-based study. And that is something that actually third parties can come in play to come in and do like a really robust risk assessment for us, for example, or anybody that deals with anything in situ mineralization or storage or anything like that. It's very important to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to identify every possible leakage pathway, even if the potential of it's happening is very minimal. So yeah, that's one way also that the third parties we would be looking into engaging with some third-party companies.
Okay, thank you. So I'm kind of coming to the end of my list of questions, which doesn't seem to be a problem because the audience is flooding the chat with questions, and there's a couple hands raised, but I guess I'll just kind of close with a couple wrapping it up points from my end. And again, this was a little bit touched on, and probably less of an issue for this panel than for some other CDRs, but CDR tech. But what are some of the biggest challenges that you see related to MRV specific to your technology, and kind of how would you advise a baby company doing what you do to overcome that, or things that you wish you'd done differently or anything? And by challenges related to MRV, I don't mean just technical, but also kind of market demands for different quality or the certification bodies, or any big challenge or something that you feel strongly about. So maybe we'll start with Friedel and then go to Casey and Elham.
Yeah, it's like where to begin. Yeah, I think a big big thing is just being new on the block, right? So getting people to trust your product, getting them to trust your process, even when it is, as we've all stated, it's really straightforward, easy to measure. There's a lot of science and data showing that, yep, this works. But it always brings a lot of skepticism when you're new. And I think in the MRV realm too, that also makes it difficult for people to understand where to place you, right? Like, do you give us risk factors for land-based projects, or do you just accept that we're telling you that the risk is much lower and you know, go with that? And so I think that's one of the challenges, is just getting people to understand how simple and trustworthy DAC plus mineralization is, and that it really deserves a second look in its own set of standards and approaches to monitoring it and to quantifying it and assessing risks.
Yeah, and just building on that, I agree. There's I would say we're all trying to move fast, and we're trying to figure out the best way, I think, to educate the market, make sure we're meeting market demands, and then continue to make things even more robust. We're spending a lot of time on the best way to be able to try to transparently report our impact in the way that I think it's going to meet the demands of the market, both for like individuals such as all those who are joining calls like this, who are imperative to the growth of the carbon markets, whether they're actually the buyers of those carbon credits, influencing it, or verifiers, or whatever it may be. So we spent a lot of time on the best way, I would say, just to package the data, because we have so many different data points associated with it. And like, what do the buyers ultimately care about the most, and also just the best way that Friedel just mentioned to walk them through it. I would say that storing CO2 in the geological sequestration, probably it gets less questions, I would say, than CO2 into concrete, even though it's still carbon mineralization with it. And so a lot of our time is spent on just education around that component, and just figuring out the best ways to be able to walk through it. And then I think just be able to put out materials just to be able to get others up to speed as well with it, and then be able to take into account their questions and then kind of iterate and so forth. So we're trying to move fast, but the more feedback that we get from those, such as those part of the air miners community, buyers, verifiers, you name it, and there's a lot of time and focus going into this, I think the better job we'll be able to do. And luckily, it's a very collaborative ecosystem. So I think we're all working together on the ability to do that, whether it's CO2 that's being stored in geological sequestration or concrete. There's a lot of the same components. Some of the specifics are a little bit different, but I think what will ultimately end up helping with what gets reported and making sure everything is credible, there'll be some similarities, but there's a lot of movement in the space on the best way to do that. So I think we're all trying to figure out as we go.
Yeah, I agree with everything Casey just mentioned. It's I'll just add a little bit for maybe some extra challenges. He did mention that, you know, we get compared all the time, for example, with you know, the conventional geological storage in saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas, but there is a lot that is missed in this conversation. Like you know, it needs education. Like, people would come and expect us to have, for example, class 6 wells, and then we have to go and explain like why they need class 6 wells, but we do not need class 6 wells. Or there's a lot of confusion as this layer of like cap rock, like, oh, how are you doing your injections without a cap rock, you know? So these are all valid questions, obviously, in the market, but yeah, it just takes a very long time. It slows down the process, you know, slows down all the permitting required for projects. So at a big global level, and also I would say at you know, local authorities, like we get challenged a lot. So this is one of the biggest challenges we deal with, and it's the thing that is slowing us down the most, basically.
Great. Thank you all so much. So there's a million questions in the chat, but I guess I'll just give all of the speakers, I don't know if there's anything that you want everyone to know or that I missed, if you have anything else to add in conclusion. Otherwise, I will start with hand raised questions.
I have a bunch of questions in the chat, so
I think I see some hands raised. Maybe we should start there.
Sure. Andrew, why don't you ask your question first, and then we'll, Monica, I know you had a question that we can go for. Andrew.
Yeah, question for CarbonCure. I mean, this is, as far as I'm aware, it's like a DAC branded event, and I've always seen what you do as kind of cool, but CCS, not DAC, and so the MRV should be kind of considered as part of the life cycle analysis of the concrete, not in terms of a carbon removal from air. Is that a fair point? I mean, I'm not like trying to invalidate what you're doing, but it just doesn't seem to be DAC, right?
So we only generate a carbon credit for the methodology that's in there, and so the CO2 has to be injected, and the CO2 source is taken into account. So for it to be carbon removal, it needs to be atmospheric CO2. So that could be DAC and biogenic. Most of our CO2 sources today are biogenic. We continue to work with DAC companies. I wish there were more Climeworks at greater scale as there are, but obviously Climeworks is continuing to lead there and trying to think of different ways to do it, but always having conversations with various DAC companies. But we spend a lot of time on the biogenic side as well. So a hybrid approach of leveraging photosynthesis with the ability to then store that CO2 durably in the short carbon cycle associated with it. But yeah, the only carbon credits we generate, it takes into account the CO2. CO2 has to be captured. Carbon removal has to be atmospheric CO2 capture, has to be permanently stored. One of the questions that Claire asked is who owns that carbon credit. Right now, we are a project developer for the stuff that we do. Ultimately, there's always collaborations such as Climeworks with Carbfix. There'll be more of those collaborations, but right now we are a project developer and own ours, and we work with our CO2 sources associated with that.
Okay.
Yeah, to clarify, my question
wait.
wasn't about, it was about additionality, not about the source of the carbon.
Right.
Yep. And yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
No. Just I want to be able to move on to the next question. So, but feel free to answer, Casey, and then we'll get to Monica's question.
Yeah, so every carbon credit has to meet minimum additionality standards and all of that. That's why we developed that methodology to have everything from leakage, the net emissions, so the net carbon credits that are generated, to the minimum additionality standards associated with it. And then we have third-party verification that goes into making sure that everything is being followed there associated with it.
Cool. Monica.
Awesome. Thanks for the insights. This is a question for Elham. As a DAC enthusiast, I'd like to have, as you were talking about the education, so I would love if you could give us a little bit of a big picture of the different types of geological sequestration types, how they differ from each other, and maybe how like there is different risk of CO2 leakage in each of those. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll just keep it very high level. So there is what we call like the conventional, the geological storage, which they inject pure CO2, either in liquid form or supercritical form. And they inject that either into saline aquifers or in depleted oil and gas wells. And both cases, they need to have like a good, robust, thick layer of caprock because that CO2 in pure phase is very buoyant and it's going to always want to escape up. So the caprock has to, hold it in the same way that caprock holds in oil and gas. For us, it's different because we inject CO2 that is dissolved into the water. And the first layer basically of storage for us is this solubility trapping. When our injection fluids enter the formation, the CO2 rich water basically is heavier than the formation water. So as the first layer, it's just going to stay down. It never wants to go up, right? That's why there is no need of a caprock. So it's just a solubility trapping. And then as soon as it enters, with the acidic nature of the fluids and the reactive rocks, it starts reacting and a mineralization trapping happens. And within the peridotite rock formations, we know that within the first 12 months, that mineralization is going to completely happen, and then there is no risk of basically any leakage or any escape or any such thing. Whereas for them, yes, of course, they take a lot of measures, obviously, into designing the well properly, choosing their site properly in a way that they assure that no leakage is going to occur. But CO2 always stays as CO2. So it's not going to be converting to rocks, in the case of the mineralization. So that's the main differences. I hope it helps.
Yeah, thank you. There was also another Air Miners event a while ago, specifically about geologic storage, going over the different types. So maybe Jason can link that in the chat, because I did see a lot of questions just kind of about storage and mineralization in general.
Yeah, mineralization and storage are, the terms might mean different. We talked about this in our pre-event alignment conversation, actually, that storage and mineralization might not mean exactly the same things.
Yeah. So
in that the like mineralization is more of a chemical reaction, yes, where storage is putting it into a something like a class 6 well or a aquifer.
yeah, so actually, Zachary, I don't know if you're going in order of the questions, but there was a question in the chat that I saw that was kind of on this topic.
Oh, sure. Why don't we do Zachary's question and then want to get to Anna Madliner's question after that? So
Yeah, I don't know if Zachary is here and you wanted to ask your question in person, but it does kind of pertain to the relatively different qualities of verification. So, Zach, are you here?
I am here, but I'm in a cafe, so there might be too much ambient noise for me to ask the question.
Okay.
If it sounds okay, I can ask it.
go for it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I was curious if the companies on the panel just had any standard operating procedures for liability in different jurisdictions. You know, I understand that mineralization and really even saline storage are both, you know, very safe, proven. Leakage probability is very, very low, but you know, I think you still have to get some assurances to local jurisdictions that there will be some kind of liability procedure in place. So, given that there are so many different regimes countrywide, statewide in the U.S., I'm curious if there's kind of any generic clauses you use in your contracts or what the plan might be going forward. Thank you.
I'll take that. Yeah, so there is a lot of conversation going around, you know, this piece that you mentioned with the insurance, you know, of the operations. And for us, as we, you know, talked about, all three of us, for this specific DAC plus mineralization, because the certainty of the, you know, the measurements and the verification is very high, and the durability of the carbon removal is also very high. It's basically permanent. We think that basically the cost of this insurance is going to, compared to some other CDR technologies, is going to be much less. We don't basically need as much insurance when it comes down to it. But yeah, it's obviously some, it's very interesting. It's definitely going to develop a lot more. As far as I'm aware, there is just a little bit of work being developed by very few companies, but I can see that it's going to be growing a lot.
Thank you. Jason, did you want to call on who's next?
I think Anna M wanted to, Anna Madliner wanted to ask a question.
Thank you. I'm interested in the company's opinions on the question we had regarding venture capital firms and third-party verification companies coming in to assist in your MRV approach. Specifically, I'm looking at it from the ocean CDR space, where I would say the CDR companies are not quite as advanced yet. So my question was regarding some more in-depth knowledge or more in-depth answer than what was given already regarding the possibility and interest of CDR companies to invest in third-party verification that's not the auditing companies for Vera, for example, in order to kind of help help scale the market and help it make more transparent and independent. So yeah, the question is how much would the CDR companies be willing to invest in third-party venture MRV?
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Friedel.
I think what we're seeing is, you know, whoever's buying our CDR services, they obviously want to see that transparency in the integrity of how we're producing it. We haven't seen many of them offering up to get involved themselves. And I think a lot of that is kind of like Elham was saying earlier, really, we're the experts in knowing how to monitor and how to measure and where things can go wrong. And so what we've employed is we've written a methodology with DNV, who's a worldwide renowned auditor, has audited many different technologies to really test the robustness of our methodology. And then they've also audited us as a third party, right? So the whole MRV process doesn't need to be all third party. It can be just the auditing part, the verifying part, the validating part can be third party, and the methodology development can be internal or collaborative, right? And so that's really how we've navigated that. And that allows us to provide people who are investing in us and buying our CDR services to see the integrity behind what we're offering them, but allows us to be the experts in knowing where we should be measuring things and, you know, outline to the auditor where they should be looking for potential things to go wrong.
The only thing I would add is that there's other forms of innovation, just even on the, we all have to come up with our own reports on what that data states, but there's even innovation just on how stuff is reported publicly to be available. And I think that would end up going a long way, coming up with a solution there that does it well and then is accepted in the market. I think will go a long way to defining just the minimum standards for data collection, reporting on stuff in a way that others can, the non-third-party auditors can go through and kind of do their own audits, or at least get comfortable with, and buyers. And that's where there's a number of companies I think who are trying to innovate there, and I think that's going to end up helping out a lot. But that's also where I think the market is trying to figure things out the most as far as what to do there associated with it. So that's the only thing I would add, kind of what the Friedel said there.
I think Jeffrey Melcy had a question.
Unmute. So actually I have a couple of questions. One is, related to who's going to certify MRV? So do you see it moving towards ISO certification? That's kind of related to the overall question of how to sell credits into the market. I'm working on biomass sequestration. The problem we're having right now is it had not been an established technique. Okay, so Pure Earth comes out with a standard method for biomass sequestration, and it's like, well, people are kind of saying that if the credits are listed in the Pure Earth marketplace, that they're okay, but ultimately, who gives them the authority to say that this is a credible technique? So
learn Spanish with Real Spanish TV.
Andrew? Okay, go ahead, Jeffrey. So that's a question about ISO, and then how to,
the other question is
and how do methodologies come up?
Yeah, so the first question is, who's going to approve MRV? Is it going to evolve into an ISO certification? Second question was around mineralization in saline formations. The assumption is that we'll drive it to a carbonate, but the question I've always had about that are people taking into consideration the equilibrium. So, we talk about mineralization by dumping olivine in the ocean. Have we considered the fact that the ocean is saturated not only in CO2, but in calcium and magnesium? So,
yep.
Is equilibrium going to be a problem? Is a reaction going to stop when it comes to equilibrium?
Yeah.
I would say I'll do the first one. I would just say that I think there are different viewpoints. I think ISO certification seems to be the minimum standard of what the market is generally aligned on what needs to be done. Sometimes there can be some additional certifications from the existing registry systems and so forth as well that can take those into account. And then there are obviously some MRV or some third-party verifiers, I think, who would just have the ISO certification, things of that nature outside of the registries. So I think, honestly, I think it comes from both. I think the market that the buyers, and then I think those such as the individuals on this call are helping to shape that. But I've heard different. I'll just say, you know, there's on the buyer side, I've heard some who want kind of the third-party verifiers to be those who come from certain certification bodies, and some who just want the ISO certification. So I think it will right now depends, and I think that's what I think there will probably be some movement, but I'm sure it'll maintain that. And then there's a lot of focus on who pays for MRV, and that's where potentially different solutions may be set up, where governments may end up setting some of the minimum thresholds and things of that nature, which could end up potentially changing that or just be an addition to that.
Sorry, I'll just quickly get to the second question. I can't speak for Ocean CDR at all, but in the case of for us that we mineralize in situ downhole into the rock formations, these rock formations are very like highly reactive with the CO2, and we see immediately as we inject the CO2 and we start recovering from the monitoring borehole, we see the buildup of the all the minerals, cations, calcium, magnesium, and all of that is occurring. I'm not sure why you mentioned saline aquifers. I also just want to again separate in situ mineralization with saline aquifers. Mineralization occurs in saline aquifers, but over like decades and decades. Like it takes nearly 100 years for a little bit of mineralization to happen. Whereas when we talk about peridotite and basalt, it's a matter of like, for us, it's a matter of 12 months basically. And I think for basalt is they mentioned it's up to 2 years. So it's a very rapid mineralization that is happening. Whereas into saline aquifers, it's a very slow and small percentage of the CO2 that mineralizes over time.
Okay. I would have asked the question at the end. We're just about out of time. Just real quick, one sentence, quick one sentence answers. I have a question. If you were starting up a new company in the space, what advice would you have for a potential entrepreneur, knowing that there are many in the audience?
Just because it's focused on MRV, this call, I would say build MRV in from the very start. It's very hard. Just if you have it built in from the very start of your solution, or at least are focused on it, you'll start building. A lot of this is just the back-end systems, and then like there's some standards on just how, like what you need to report within that, but start building in. Think about MRV from the very beginning. That way you can try to automate some things or have more robust data collection rather than having to go back in after the fact, which can be a little bit harder. So that would be my tip.
Yeah, I would second that with get involved in MRV really quickly. So not, in addition to what Casey's saying, also get involved in all the conversations. It's a big, fast developing space, and the faster you can get to speed and be a part of it, the better your chances are of being well represented in the MRV that's being developed.
Yeah, I agree with both Friedel and Casey. I guess we all understand the importance of the MRV. I would just add a little piece that baseline measurements are very important, especially if there is anything in situ. So just upfront before jumping into injection or mineralization in general, it's very important to have a really robust understanding of your site, your reservoir, and do as much baseline measurements and studies as possible.
Claire, any last thoughts?
No, I feel like lucky everyone on this panel kind of has it easy relative to a lot of CDR tech. But it does seem like my interpretation of most of the questions is there is just this concern that the verification should be somebody who's not selling the credit and not doing the CDR, but rather a third party. And so, yeah, that's not necessarily up to us on the panel, but I'm sure that will take shape really quickly and hopefully reflect in the prices of the sales, the really high quality MRV being done by the people on this panel. So yeah, thank you all.
High quality MRV for high quality panel. And high quality moderator. So thank you, Claire, and thank you, Casey, and thank you, Elham, and thank you, Friedel, and thank you to our audience as well. So many questions out there. Regret that we didn't have time to get to them all. Have shared the email addresses of each of our speakers today so that you could ask your questions if you didn't get the chance to do so yourself in the chat. Our next event is going to be in 2 weeks' time on October 26th. We have a little bit of a date change, but we're going to talk about storytelling in CDR, going into film and video making. So should be a really interesting topic that we're going to breach. And then after that, we'll do some more MRV events in November. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. If you have any questions or comments about how we conducted the event, I also shared a link to our audience post-event survey so that we can hear what you had to say and we can make our events better in the future. So thanks, everyone.